Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of In Grok We Trust. Before I did speak about what the series is about in the first episode of Eat Grok Love, but just let me recap for those of you who didn't see that. So this series is going to be me speaking about my favorite subjects, religion, belief, the human mind, the sort of tricks that the mind can get up to when it wants to hold on to a belief, and broadening out as well on that, like different things like sociology and philosophy and anthropology. The origins of things is one of my favorite subjects. All of this and more I'm going to try and get into in this series, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm very happy to have you guys here with me. So thank you for tuning in. In this episode, I really wanted to get into something that actually I was going to be doing in the second episode of Grokcast, but my brother has had some trouble with his microphone, and so I thought I'd do this here. And that's better, in fact, actually, because then we can focus Grokcast more on him. So what I'll be talking about is my development, my spiritual development, you could call it, from childhood until the present day. Sort of how I've come to believe and think the way I do today. So yes, let me get straight into it. So I don't really remember the first time that I heard of God or Jesus. I grew up in South Africa, and so, went to public schools, and I must have sung hymns right from the very beginning, Christian hymns, but I've got no real specific memory. I do remember around 6 or 7 years old, our family used to stand in a circle while my father prayed. And I liked how we didn't need to close our eyes like we had to do in school, It felt like we were special, that we had a more special connection with God. That's the habit of the Old Apostolic Church of Africa, which my father was part of. And so yes, that's some of my first memories. Also, actually thinking back now in pre-primary, we used to sing some hymn that ended with, or not a hymn, but actually like a fun song, for children that said at the end, "Thank you, God, for everything." So yes, I think that was the general idea I had of God at that age, was just of being thankful, grateful that I had parents and friends and sunshine and pets and, all the animals and butterflies and birds. Grateful to God for providing all these things. But then there was also the other sort of side to it, the tedious solemnity of going to church and being bored there. I've got some sort of vague memories of being very young, and those aisles, they were so huge. Aisles and aisles of long, glossy wooden benches, and the priest talking in front about nothing I could understand. But I had to be quiet, and yeah, it was sort of nostalgic memories of that time, sort of, falling asleep in my mother's lap, and my brothers and I annoying her with our restlessness. But yes, so those were the early times. And we moved around a lot in my first years of school, so I had lots of different schools and friends, and paradigms changed, a lot. And I think I'm grateful for that nowadays, because I think it's made me into a very versatile person. I can deal with change pretty easily. But yes, even so, God and Christianity were a common theme through all the change. And I think my first recollection of questioning it all when I was around 8 years old. I remember clearly being by myself in our front garden in a town called Hoedspruit in northern South Africa. And I looked at a rock, and I'm not sure why, but I suddenly got it in my head to speak or think to God. Something like, "Come on, we're alone now. Nobody's looking. Just make that rock move. Just make it move. Or like just tip over, or make it roll a little bit, and forevermore I will know that you are really there and you exist." But yes, of course the rock stayed where it was, And though I later learned that it was supposedly wrong to test God in that way, his reluctance to simply move a stupid rock did not increase my confidence in him. Still, at that age, I had nothing against God and belief, and I didn't think too much about it. I just shrugged my shoulders and moved on. And the next milestone that I can remember was when I was 10 years old. I had been given a 1 Rand coin, and at the time, now 1 Rand is really nothing, but at the time it meant a lot to me. It was a lot of money for me. I could buy quite a few fireballs with it at the tuck shop at school. And on that day, I think it was something like during first break, I forgot about it, and then at second break, I wanted to buy my fireballs and found my pocket empty, and I was really, really sad about that. So after school, I decided to pace the entire field looking for my 1 Rand coin, and basically wasted the whole afternoon there. And after a few hours, I couldn't find it, and I walked off the field dejectedly. And I remember very clearly, as I sort of got to the pavement part of the field, I stopped and I thought, and I prayed to God. I was like, no, come on, I've spent all afternoon here. I don't want to go home empty-handed. Please, God, help me find my 1 Rand coin. And what happened is I turned around and walked back onto the field, and after a few paces, boom, there it was right in front of me. And I couldn't believe it. I picked it up and went away very happy, not only because I'd found the coin, but because, of course, now for me, that was confirmation. I knew that God existed now, and I would never again doubt. And of course, this story, this is what happens to many of us, and why people believe. And I'll get into why that isn't proof of God at all in a different episode, I think. But yes, so that single event sustained my belief in God and Jesus by association for at least 4 to 5 years. But these were also the years in which my curiosity about space and the universe started. I remember copying visual representations of the Big Bang Theory from a library book and trying to understand how the 4 forces work, the 4 forces being gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and the electromagnetic force. And I remember how clever I felt like in my first year of high school when my science teacher praised me for already knowing the basics of atoms, protons and neutrons and electrons and all of that. But it wasn't just space and atoms, it was anything my mind could sink its teeth into. Our library was really good, our small town library. And of course, it was before I had the internet, and I absorbed anything that engaged my interest. I loved the idea of astrology and numerology, and I started reading science fiction and fantasy. And it was a special day when I found Richard Bach's books. I read One and Illusions first, and Illusions ended up being my sort of Bible for a very long time. I recommend that book. Everybody go and read Richard Bach's Illusions. But yes, so slowly but surely I was introduced to more and more paradigms, and like any teenager, I incorporated them effortlessly into my worldview. But there are certain events that stand out in my memory that should really help illustrate the process, like in which I at times was a true believer, and at other times I was a tenacious skeptic. So one of them was the library books, as I've mentioned, with the universe and atoms, etc. And so yes, science took an early hold, and yet for so long I held on to belief because I wanted to believe, which is most people's problem. The desire to believe trumps whatever evidence they encounter. And I remember feeling particularly righteous once when my mother showed me, I think I was about 14, and my mother showed me a one-page text she had gotten off the internet, or that somebody had given her from the internet. And the text was something. It was like something that ridiculed believers in some terribly truthful way. I don't really remember though, because that's the thing. I read it, but I don't remember. All I remember is the disheartened look on my mother's face and her tone of voice as she said something like, it's things like this that really make me wonder. And, she just seemed kind of sad. And then after reading it, I simply stated to her that it doesn't bother me one bit, that it's obviously designed by the devil via the hand of some unsuspecting soul to lead us into doubtful turmoil. I said, ignore it. Just ignore it. And my mother slowly showed relief and said how proud she was of me, and I went away beaming inside. Like how insidious the devil is and how easily I cast him aside with the strength of my faith. So yeah. Something else that happened maybe a year or two earlier is, that's also sort of marked in my mind, is I had done something naughty, something that where my father caught me. And after being admonished, he also sort of took me aside and said that I should remember that whenever I do something like that, whenever I feel like I want to do something naughty, that was the devil whispering in my ear. And this didn't really reduce my misbehavior, but it did increase how guilty I felt whenever I did anything naughty. And more importantly, I think it started a little mind game in my head, which ended up being instrumental in the eventual demise of my belief in Christianity. So, thank you, Daddy, for that. Basically, the mind game was me trying to figure out, thinking about what he said, and then later on always looking at my mind and wondering if it was God telling me or showing me to something, or only the devil tricking me into thinking that it was God, and all the trickery that can come into play with that. And in the end, I realized that it was really just me arguing with myself. But yeah, man, so many other memories are coming back to me now as I relate this all to you guys. I think what I'll do is I'll just make a list here quickly, and then relate each one to you guys, and I can talk about them each as we go, or maybe even make an episode on each one, because some of them are worthy of really getting into in more detail. Okay, so here's the list I've made. The movie The Matrix is the first one. I don't know about you guys, but the first time I saw The Matrix, do you remember that? The mind-blowing moment? Yes, I think this is one thing that I can get into, like how reality might not be really real. I'll get into that in a different episode. Another thing is looking at someone walking across the street or anywhere and imagining that I were them looking at me. I remember doing this when I was in school, waiting for the bus and just watching people. And not only imagining that I was them looking at me, but imagining being them, imagining being me looking back at them. And that sort of makes you realize, this goes into the sort of shared experience thing, like, is what you feel the same thing that I feel in the same situation? And also, like with colors, I'm sure we've all thought, you all know the question of, is my red the same as the red that you see? But yes, again, that's another thing worthy of an entire episode. Something else was, as I grew up, learning about space and things, as I mentioned in the library, I used to imagine, trying to hold the entire universe in my mind. I mean, just the size of the universe really boggles the mind, if you start to read about that. But yeah, I often used to do that. I'd think about the Earth and how big it was with all the millions of people on it, and our place in the galaxy, in the supercluster, and also just our species on Earth being one of millions of species that have evolved on Earth, and that we're just another animal here on Earth. That really used to boggle my mind. Then there were, of course, the books that I ended up reading. I've made a list here. We've got Dune by Frank Herbert. Man, that's an amazing giant series. It's the sort of the Lord of the Rings of the science fiction world. Lord of the Rings here is also on the list. And Otherland by Tad Williams. I've mentioned already Richard Bach. He wrote many great books. He sort of makes you feel like he's your friend and he's just telling you a story. I really do recommend you go and read some of Richard Bach's books. And then there's The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. A beautiful book, very poetic and philosophical. And then we've got Sophie's World, of course, by Justine Gardner. Never known how to pronounce that name. Sophie's World. And Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And maybe also Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. All of these books were instrumental in sort of introducing me to new paradigms and making me really think about the world. At an age, I think, that most people don't actually get into these things. And then we have the question of, does God know what you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow morning? This is another whole episode, which I'll get into, but it basically leads to a free will dilemma. And then there's another one, the final one on my list here, trying to imagine not existing. Now, this is really interesting, and it makes your mind do backflips. It's not only just imagining from a third point of view that there's the Earth with nobody on it. I mean actually trying to imagine non-existence itself. Yeah, I've done this. I remember doing it when I was very young, and it really just makes your brain sort of go like, well, what's happening? Trying to imagine non-existence from a zero point of view. Just try it, and you guys will see what I'm saying. So yes, anyway, after years of this sort of thing, introspection and asking questions and that sort of thing, I finally came to a milestone of truth at around 15 or 16 years old. I remember clearly, I was talking to my friend Francois at school, and I remember the exact corridor actually, just before going into the hall. And I remember stating how ridiculous it actually was to believe that we were all born in sin, like guilty as a baby. And even more ridiculous that we had to be saved by a guy that had lived like over 2,000 years ago. And he stopped at some point and he asked me, like, so you're not really a Christian then, are you? And that got me, because as much as I had rebelled and argued and questioned, I got into trouble quite a few times at school. As much as all of that, I had at that point not yet officially branded myself as an unbeliever as such. So when I said to him, when I answered, actually, no, I'm not, it was really surreal, At that point, I felt that I'd crossed a certain threshold, and I remember feeling quite exhilarated and like free all of a sudden in a certain way, So yeah, from that there followed a long period of a type of agnosticism, even though I only heard of the term agnostic from my auntie Vida almost a year later. And so shortly after that I got the internet for the first time. And then the fun really started. I really thought of myself as so clever. I started a channel in IRC called Philosophy, and I had lots of great conversations over there. And I really loved the word agnostic, because sort of at that time I thought of atheists as just another brand of believers. I thought that believing that a God doesn't exist is just the same as believing that a God does exist. And I just thought of them as just as silly as believers. Saying like, how can you know? You don't know. So everyone is agnostic if you're being honest with yourself. And yeah, I mean, now I don't think that, and I'll get into that in a different episode. But yes, that was my philosophy, and it was a good philosophy at the time, I think, and still is today, is to be okay with uncertainty, with not knowing, and then being able to just play with ideas within your uncertainty. Because if you make yourself certain of something, if you believe something, then you generally don't need to ask questions, do you? And playing with ideas might be anathema to whatever you believe, which is just not conducive to learning at all. Anyway, so it was playing with ideas that after school I joined a spiritual community. And that was a naive decision on my part, but I won't get into that at the moment. I stayed there for an entire 2 weeks before running back to my mother's house. But yes, my thinking at that time sort of veered into the new agey spiritualist trap, as I call it now. The kind of thinking where all is one and God is love and God is energy. All capital letters, of course. Energy with a capital letter. And I've never read The Secret, but I think had I read it, I would have enjoyed it a lot. You know, where energy, you attract, positive energy attracts good things in your life, etc. And after moving out from my mother's place, I moved into a house where a family was pagan, a pagan family. People I still love today. They're amazing people. And so with them, I decided to call myself pagan too, follower of the old ways, having a deeper respect for life and sort of the mother goddess. The Egyptian pantheon was my favorite. It still is to a certain extent today when you're talking about mythology. And that was because of Tad Williams, the book I mentioned earlier, Otherland. That was an amazing mystery, sci-fi, fantasy story, which I really recommend you all read. But anyway, so I got into this pantheistic state of mind where the universe is God and God is the universe, etc. But in my defense, I never really believed in gods, I don't think, or the goddess, not as anything sentient. My goddess was a pantheistic Mother Nature sort of goddess, and all the other gods were sort of thought constructs. The way I thought about it was like Mother Nature, the goddess, being a crystal, and all the other gods of the pantheon being different facets of the crystal. And I've grown out of that phase, needless to say. But at the time, I believed that reality could be influenced by thought alone, and that's how I sort of explained when people told me that they prayed to God and that their prayers were answered. I explained it as exactly that, their will being cast out into the universe, and if the patterns were amenable to what they wanted, and if they had the right sort of positive energy, they could attract their will back to themselves and so get what they wanted through that. Anyway, after this bohemian lifestyle in Cape Town, I was living with my mother again when I met my first girlfriend. And then life took a drastic turn. My spiritual side fell away a little bit as my emotional development side took over. I mean, I was in my first relationship, and so I had to mature and learn things that most people deal with in their teenage years. I was already 21 and I hadn't really been in a serious relationship yet. So yes, with my first girlfriend, I had to start thinking more practically. I was a man now, after all, and in a serious relationship. It lasted for 3.5 years. So I went off and I started working and got into different jobs. And spiritually, I went into a kind of limbo. I still had different ideas floating in and out, and I always used to write. I wrote a lot, as I mentioned in a previous video. But yeah, I had to get my life in order. So a more practical side kicked in. And so yes, until around March 2012, I stayed in that spiritual limbo state. I had moved to Brazil, and life had just taken over, and these spiritual matters were just sort of in the background. And I would have stayed that way, I think, had it not been for my brother Bradley. What happened was, I mean, my brother, he's an intelligent guy, and we had many, growing up, we had many good moments together where we talked about these deeper things in life. But then, all the way from here in Brazil, I watched him become a hardcore Christian, because he had stayed in the small town that we grew up in Bredasdorp. And yeah, he became a Christian, influenced by my different things there, including our uncle. And so what happened was I asked him about that. I just couldn't understand it, like, what happened, Bradley? We agreed on so much before, and now you're just as bad as the worst sort of Christians we used to criticize. And he promised me that he would one day write and tell me why that all happened. And I think we might get into that in the next Grokcast episode, because now that I've sort of talked about myself here, I'm glad actually that we'll be able to focus more on him in that episode. I am happy to say that he is, once again, he has joined the ranks of non-believers. But yes, okay, so that's what got me again into thinking about these matters seriously. So thank you, Bradley, for that. And so yes, that's basically the end of the story. I got back into it, and I started writing a lot more. I've written a few posts in different places, which I might base some of the episodes here of In Grok We Trust on. And it is now my favorite thing to do and think about what is true and where do we come from, the origins of things, and the very nature of reality itself. All of it. And I've started reading a lot more about this. I'll get into the kinds of authors. I don't want to, because I'm going to end the video now. It's been half an hour. I think I might actually break this video into two, because I really didn't intend it for it to be half an hour. But yes, suffice to say, I think I have matured a lot and refined the way I see things. And I've never felt better about the way I see things now than right now. I haven't become set in my ways like many people do as they get older. Not yet, anyway. But yes, as I said, I will get into the way I see the universe in a different episode. I am essentially atheist, but like I said in the previous video, I don't like this term atheist because of how so many people have connotations about it and it's true, many atheists are just real assholes sometimes, and so I don't like to call myself atheist. But atheism is non-theism. I am a non-believer, and I keep my mind open to all the possibilities as long as there is evidence for whatever anyone is claiming. But okay, let me end this here, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed that, and if you have any comments, please do leave comments, because these are things that there is something I want to do, is I will read the comments, and after I have enough of them, I'll make an episode specifically answering your questions and comments. So please do that, and just let me know what you think in general. And of course, click the like button and subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye bye. Catholic Church of Africa, which my father was part of. And so yes, that's some of my first memories. Also, actually thinking back now, in pre-primary, we used to sing some hymn that ended with, or not a hymn, but actually like a fun song, for children, that said at the end, "Thank you, God, for everything." So yes, I think that was the general idea I had of God at that age, was just of being thankful, grateful that I had parents and friends and sunshine and pets and, all the animals and butterflies and birds. Grateful to God for providing all these things, believe and think the way I do today. So yes, let me get straight into it. So I don't really remember the first time that I heard of God or Jesus. I grew up in South Africa, and so, went to public schools, and I must have sung hymns right from the very beginning, Christian hymns, but I've got no real specific memory. I do remember around 6 or 7 years old, our family used to stand in a circle while my father prayed, and I liked how we didn't need to close our eyes like we had to do in school. It felt like we were special, that we had a more special connection with God. That's the habit of the old apostolic. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of In Grok We Trust. Before I did speak about what the series is about in the first episode of Eat Grok Love, but just let me recap for those of you who didn't see that. So this series is going to be me speaking about my favorite subjects, religion, belief, the human mind, the sort of tricks that the mind can get up to when it wants to hold on to a belief, and broadening out as well on that, like different things like sociology and philosophy and anthropology. The origins of things is one of my favorite subjects. All of this and more I'm going to try and get into in this series, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm very happy to have you guys here with me. So thank you for tuning in. In this episode, I really wanted to get into something that actually I was going to be doing in the second episode of Grokcast, but my brother has had some trouble with his microphone, and so I thought I'd do this here. And that's better, in fact, actually, because then we can focus Grokcast more on him. So what I'll be talking about is my development, my spiritual development, you could call it, from childhood until the present day. Sort of how I've come to things. But then there was also the other sort of side to it, the tedious solemnity of going to church and being bored there. I've got some sort of vague memories of being very young, and those aisles, they were so huge, aisles and aisles of long glossy wooden benches, and the priest talking in front about nothing I could understand, but I had to be quiet. And yeah, it was sort of nostalgic memories of that time, sort of, falling asleep in my mother's lap, and my brothers and I annoying her with our restlessness. But yes, so those were the early times.